unmuted?
Yes.
And I hope everyone can see the screen. I'm the least important thing here, it's the buildings. But I've even put some candles on in the background to try and create a bit of atmosphere. But it's lovely to see lots of you here. What worries me slightly is my family are all the ones who seem to be having most problems getting onto this. So I hope you've all managed to see some of this now. So the country house in Derbyshire. A good way, I suppose, to start this series of lectures, because Derbyshire is extremely rich in country houses, as many of you know. And if you don't know, it's a county which is so worth visiting, not just for the country houses, of course. It has got a tremendous industrial heritage, a tremendous agricultural heritage. There's no great medieval church, cathedral, but there are many wonderful medieval churches. There's no great cathedral. And in Derby, we have the cathedral there, is a Georgian parish church, actually designed by no less than Gibbs, with one of the latest Gothic, purely Gothic church towers built in this country. You know, Derbyshire is an absolute rich spot for architecture. Derbyshire is proud to be able to say that internationally important examples of country houses can be found from nearly every period, from the medieval times right up to the 19th century and really beyond. Wikipedia says about Derbyshire, the area that is now Derbyshire was first visited, probably briefly, which I think is a bit unkind, by humans 200,000 years ago. Well, it's been visited by an enormous amount of people ever since then, who flock to the landscape for enjoying it for walks, or of course, some of them flock to see the country houses. For 2 millenniums, it has been an intensely industrial place as well, using lead, iron, coal, and limestone, amongst other things. Lead smelting itself, which is the process where heat is used to extract the raw material of lead, has been going on in Derbyshire since the Roman times, and the water-powered smelting mills since the Elizabethan times. And of course, the Elizabethan times saw some of the most remarkable architecture in our county spring up. You can see the scarring of this lead heritage around the county, but particularly near the village where I'm from, in Bonsall, and in such lead veins as the wonderfully named the Beans and the Bacon, Old Eye, and Fiery Dragon. These are just some of the remains of mines which have been worked since 1541. Derbyshire, thanks to Richard Arkwright and Strutt and others, became known as the home of the Industrial Revolution. And in the 18th and 19th century, Buxton and Matlock Bath became very important spa towns. The former was really created by the Dukes of Devonshire, and the Crescent at Buxton is undergoing, and actually has undergone a tremendous restoration, and you can now stay there and you can even swim there and experience the baths. I know Barry Joyce, one of our trustees and the vice chairman, has done just that. And Derby had become a centre for engineering in the 19th century and the base for the North Midland Railway. Various families in this county have featured highly in house building, as well as patrons and builders themselves. The Peverell family, we hear about them quite a lot in the history of Derbyshire. Peverell of the Peak, of course, Peverell Castle, but places like Bolsover Castle, the extraordinary Renaissance palace on the hill, was a Peverell Castle in the medieval times. Then we have families like the Vernons of Haddon and later on Sudbury Hall. The Fitzherbert family of Norbury and latterly Tissington Hall. The Cavendish family, of course, going along the M1, you might as well be in Cavendishville. You're surrounded by signs to all these extraordinary houses, which we created mainly off the back of the many times married Bess of Hardwick. And then, of course, you've got architectural dynasties like the Smithson, Robert Smithson, Senior and Junior, and places most famously like Hardwick, and also Olcott's, which was another house which Bess of Hardwick was building, and other smaller houses like Barbara Hall, which is possibly a Smithson house, and even Tissington as well, slightly later, but these Midlands tower houses, semi-fortified looking, but of course purely residential. And then Smith of Warwick, of course not a Derbyshire man, but did work all over the Midlands, and really a follower of Gibbs, but an important architect in his own right. And then our very own Georgian Robert Adam, Joseph Pickford of Derby, a particular favourite of mine, for so long overlooked. A lot of his buildings were assumed to be by Robert Adam. And actually Pickford knew Adam. He worked at Kedleston, and also he worked at Holcombe Hall, and he created many magnificent houses in Derbyshire, the greatest one of which was to be a new house for the Harper family at Cork, and it was never built. And as usual with Cork Abbey, the plans were found in a drawer, and so they're rather tantalising. But a lot of Joseph Pickford of Derby architecture still exists at places like Ashford Hall, Ogston Hall, underneath all the Victorian later decoration, the Ashbourne Mansion, the Grey House in Ashbourne, all over the county, and wonderful architect. So Derbyshire is very rich in all of these things. So without further ado, we'll launch into a bit about some of the buildings, just to give you an introduction to this wonderful county from the country house point of view. So here we have Peverell Castle, which a number of you have probably been to. Very important building. It is one of the earliest Norman castles in England. And it was established very soon after the Norman conquest. And here you really see mainly the keep, which of course is the tall structure on the right. And it was built by Henry II in 1176. And the castle is named after William Peverell, the great William Peverell, who was keeper of the royal forest. And the site of the castle was here to control and police the hunting grounds and also the lead and silver mines, which were so rich even at this period. And unusually for a castle of its time, it was constructed of stone, not of wood and other materials. And the architecture itself, you can just about make it out, is typically Norman, round-headed arches, not pointed. Of course, we're not at Gothic at all yet. And you've got to imagine a square keep with some chevron decoration, the sort of zigzags, but limited decoration, 4 square, and a pretty strident-looking building. So we then come on to somewhere also equally important, slightly later, Norbury Manor, first built in the 14th century for the great Fitzherbert family. And the manor is just one of the important buildings in this little grouping. The church itself is a lantern of medieval glass, an extraordinary building, like the miniature Saint-Chapelle of Derbyshire, with the Fitzherbert tombs. But here we have a wonderful example of a 14th century hall house, manor house. You've got the undercroft below, of course, and on the first floor, where you've got these decorated Gothic windows, is the Great Hall. And as with any great hall at the time, you have a high and a low end. The high end being the end where the dais is, where the lord of the manor would sit. And as you still see in collegiate halls in Oxford and Cambridge and elsewhere, that is where the important people sit, all the fellows, and then all of us plebs sit in the rest of it. And basically, it was like that in these manor houses. So the low end was where the entrances to the butteries and kitchens were. And you really see the hall keeping a similar function right up through the history of British country house architecture. So often off a hall, you will have the much more mundane rooms, and on the other side, the reception rooms. So that is Norbury Manor. Now, Haddon Hall, one of the great treasures of Derbyshire, if not the finest medieval manor house of its type in Britain. It has 11th century origins, and it is an organically grown house. It sort of tumbles down the hill, and it is both stupendous as well as homely, magnificent as well as charming and comfortable, apart from when the heating's off probably, which I imagine it probably is a lot of the time. But anyway, it's an extraordinary building, and it has been with the Vernon family and their descendants since the 12th century. Of course, it is still in the family of the Manners family, who married the Vernons married the Manners, and it is now still home of Lord Edward Manners and has been home to his family, the Dukes of Rutland, for a long time now. William Peverell, again we hear his name, owned the manor in 1087, and he got the license to crenellate, to make it fortified or semi-fortified, in 1194. And St King John's Wall still remains by the side of the chapel, part of this earlier curtain wall. And Haddon was never a castle, but to all the world it looks like a castle, and it's often being used in Jane Eyre for Thornfield Hall. Then later on, much later in the history of this house, of course, it was restored because it had become somewhat of a curiosity, and often with curiosities they're left and they sort of rot, and that's what happened to Haddon. And the 9th Duke, John Manners, restored it in the 1920s in a wonderful fashion. And you go into the Long Gallery and you see a portrait by Rex Whistler of the Duke and his son at that time. And it's very hard to tell, as it is with a lot of the arts and crafts houses, which is what the time when Haddon was redone, what is old and what is new. And timber was brought from the estate to restore in 1920 as it would have been back in the 15th century and beyond. So here is Haddon from the air. You see 2 courtyards. And on the left, top left, is the entrance tower. And you've got the forecourt there, where you've got the chapel, bottom left, with its little belfry, Gothic belfry. And to the right of the chapel is that wing is built partly on King John's Wall. And then top right, you've got Peverell's Tower, one of the earliest parts of the house. And to the right of the building, so bottom right, jutting along, is the Long Gallery. And I'll just show you a plan of the house as well. Here we have it. Rather confusingly, it's been flipped around now, so you've just got to imagine it's gone the other way. You've just seen chapel, top right, and then you've got the blackest part of the drawing is the earliest part of the house, including King John's Wall, which is just to the left of the chapel. And these 2 courtyards, the lower courtyard, where much more public space, the upper courtyard, where the family rooms would, in the past and still do, have their views out there. So distinctly public and private. Here is the wonderful chapel at Haddon, built in 1427, and it's famous for its pre-Reformation frescoes on the walls, some of which of course have gone, but they're magnificent, some slightly macabre and spooky. And also it's famous for its beautiful Nottinghamshire alabaster reredos below the great east window. And here is the Great Hall of 1370. We're looking towards the low end of the hall. So you can see the stonework below the gallery at the end has pointed doors leading into the butteries, the kitchens, and the stewards' rooms. Later on, this gallery was put around the room to link it to the family rooms. The ceiling is a restoration from the time of 1920 of the Duke then. And we're really looking at the hall from the dais end. So looking where we would be, we are sitting here, if you like, where the Lord would have sat looking at the rest of the household. And when it was first built, there would have been a central hearth in this room. There wouldn't have been a fireplace on the wall, which we're so used to now in houses. There would have been a central hearth, which would have, its smoke would have gone up to the center of the ceiling and gone out through a louvre, so a shuttered spire type contraption to take it all out. So this is the Long Gallery, which actually the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust were very lucky. Lord Edward let the trust come and have an event there. And I was roped in to sing in this wonderful space, which was a complete joy for me, a great pleasure and an honour. So here we see this magnificent gallery, perhaps by Robert Smithson himself, but certainly of the type. And any important house at the time, or even less important houses, would have wanted a long gallery. And the one at Haddon is lovely. It slightly slopes. The glass in the windows, the leaded glass, is put at different angles, so it ripples with the light and casts these wonderful shadows on the paneling. And long galleries were used for exercise, obviously to show the scale of the house, to show off, and also would have had a lot of imagery and heraldry to show of the obligations to the royal family, but also of marriages to other aristocratic and landowning families, basically a giant photograph album to show off. So now we might have a picture of Beckham, perhaps. In those days, you would have a very nice little cartouche of your relation to a duke or someone like that. And so this is the Long Gallery, one of the peculiarities of British architecture, and something which lasted really from about 1520, one of the earliest is in Hampshire at the Vine, right up until in Ireland, for example, at Castletown, into the Georgian era. But they became rooms that were outdated because the Georgians simply didn't like these tunnel-like rooms. And they are slightly odd if you think about them, but they're rather marvellous. So on to one of the most extraordinary of all Renaissance houses, really in Europe. This is Hardwick Hall. More glass than wall, as you can see, as often has been said about it. Built between 1590 and 1597 and designed by Robert Smithson, almost certainly designed by Robert Smithson, for Bess of Hardwick, 4 times married. Bess started her life as the daughter of a sort of not a particularly well-off gentleman of Hardwick. She married several times, including to Cavendish, by whom she had some heirs. And finally, no children, but finally she married the grandest of all, the Earl of Shrewsbury, the Premier Earl of England. And you can see she's emblazoned ES on top of each of the towers, Elizabeth Shrewsbury. She was so proud of it. And I think she milked poor old Shrewsbury dry of all his money. But she was quite a formidable person. I was reading some the other day that she put up her own monument in Derby Cathedral just because she wasn't quite sure anyone else would erect one so nicely to her. But she built these extraordinary houses, and she kept the ruins of her old house close to Hardwick Hall, the current house. And you can see very clearly the importance of the floors increases as you go up. So below the towers, there is a very tall floor with these great windows. That is where the staterooms are, including the long gallery. And on the top floor, you've got these towers letting out onto the roof for banqueting, for watching the hunt go past. Hardwick is magnificently sited now above the M1, but in those days above a very nice sort of verdant valley. So now we'll go inside. Actually, of course, I need to mention as well, by this time, symmetry had come in a big way. And it was still quite a new thing. Of course, in Italy, the Renaissance architects were well aware of symmetry, building some fantastically elegant structures. In England, we were very much function followed form. Very much, sorry, form followed function, or whatever way around it is. But what I mean to say is that the way the building worked was echoed in the architecture. By this time, symmetry is the most important thing, and it's a very new thing that Bess of Hardwick's doing. And in this house, which was very peculiar also, instead of having the great hall with the high and low ends, the hall in this house goes straight through the building in an axial fashion, which was also very new and an Italian Renaissance type thing to do. So we'll go inside. Actually, no, we won't first. We're going to have a look at the house from the ruins of Bess's old house, which she kept there for billeting less important guests and staff in, but also, I suppose, as a reminder. She was very proud of where she'd come from. She was very ambitious and didn't mind if anyone knew it because it was pretty obvious. So inside, this is the high great chamber, almost the throne room of Hardwick, because really after Queen Elizabeth I, Bess was the most powerful woman in England. The frieze here is probably by someone called Abraham Smith and his assistants, and it features a forest theme on the court of Diana, with a menagerie of animals, deer, lions, elephants, monkeys, etc., all exotic and showing that perhaps someone had travelled to see them. But when you look at the anatomically, you can see very clearly they probably haven't travelled at all. But still, it was a great sign of the richness and luxury of this household. And elsewhere are hunting scenes. Other friezes are more skillfully done, with allegorical figures of Venus chastising Cupid and summer. These are based on contemporary Flemish engravings by Crispin van der Pas from the designs of Martin de Vos. So she's very much showing she's up to date, and also that Europe is far closer to the high aristocracy like Bess than to mere mortals. And it's a magnificent house, and one of the most unforgettable things is the great staircase, which weaves its way in a monumental and quite plain fashion, and it's so gently ascending that you get to the top floor without really realizing you've gone so high up, but in fact you've climbed and climbed and climbed. And it was beautifully preserved. The tapestries are all beautifully preserved here under the watchful eye of Evelyn, Duchess of Devonshire, who came here. It was her dower house in the earlier part of the last century, and she was such a skilled needleworker that the professional needleworkers later on, and the National Trust needleworkers, were in absolute awe of the standard of what she achieved there. But she lived in this house as a home, which is hard to believe in this great lofty rooms, for quite a long time in her widowhood. So, on to Tissington Hall, a house I know very well and I'm very fond of, and this was built in 1609 for the Fitzherbert family, who'd been at Tissington for two centuries before then. And as at Hardwick, it has an axial hall, so a hall that goes right through the building, so not to the left or right, but straight through. And you can see it's quite castle-like. And like Hardwick, it's hinting at fortified architecture, but the glass basically shows that no one's going to be able to, it's not going to be able to defend it. So I wonder if we've got some extra noise there. I wonder if we can, maybe that's gone now. So it's just a whizzing noise. But anyway, I'll carry on. But anyway, so you can see by this time the country house really is being born out of castle architecture. And so they're not designed to be fortified. They are becoming country houses. And Tissington is also a place which you can go to. It's got some other tremendous bits of architecture to the Georgian period, and also arts and crafts by Arnold Mitchell. So going on, we get to Bolsover, somewhere I only got to know relatively recently, actually. It was built on the earthwork ruins of a castle that had belonged to Peverell, and it was sold by the 7th Earl of Shrewsbury to his brother, Sir Charles Cavendish, son of Bess. Sorry, not to his brother, but to one of the Cavendishes, Charles Cavendish, son of Bess. It was built by Robert Smithson, and on the left you can see Little Castle, and on the right you've got the Long Gallery range and staterooms. Little Castle was completed in 1621. And in 1665, the new hall and staterooms were added with the elevation of William Cavendish to the dukedom of Newcastle upon Tyne. And it really is an extraordinary building. When you go to the outside of the Long Gallery range, you can see on the right here, there are cannon-like structures in stone but placed between the windows. It's an extraordinary Mannerist, strange building. It's unlike anything else in England. And there's a very strange courtyard to the right of the little castle where there were sort of booths for people to sort of tell each other how much they loved each other and God knows what else. I mean, it must have been quite a sort of pleasure house, but it's a rather remarkable building. And again, it's hinting at castle architecture, but it's by this stage very much medieval pageantry and the fun of it, but it's not trying to be fortified. And so here we are inside Bolsover, the pillar parlour, which you can see why it's called that on the left, and the Star Chamber on the right. The fireplaces at Bolsover were actually derived from Sebastiano Serlio's book of architecture, so correct classical detail. But of course here, as with all the architects of the time, even in the highest stratas, as at Bolsover, the masons' language was still Gothic. So you have got these strange combinations of classical and Gothic, which are utterly charming and something which the Italians would laugh at, but something which we find charming now. Bolsover Castle also exhibited the first instance in England of the fireplace being placed in a corner of a room. So they were groundbreaking, these houses. And along the walls of these great rooms, you find prophets and saints painted by someone familiar, again, with the latest Flemish painting and art of around 1621. So again, terribly up to date. And it took these tremendously groundbreaking people like Bess of Hardwick and later on families like the Cecil family at Hatfield and Berlin, all these places, the new men and women of the era to create these, breaking the boundaries of what the old aristocracy had done before. This is Sudbury Hall, which is now a National Trust, but the Vernon family still own a lot of the estate and still are resident at Sudbury, just adjacent to the house. Now, this is a bizarre house, really, because to all the world, it looks like an Elizabethan E-plan house. And it's got the brickwork, it's got the checkered sort of effect in the brickwork there, which is the diaper work, it's called, spelt sort of like diaper, like American nappy, but diaper work, which is very much Elizabethan and Tudor thing. You see it at Hampton Court. But this house was built in the middle and latter part of the 17th century. And the center of it, you've got this magnificent Baroque, almost like a double altarpiece. So it's a strange house, Sudbury. It's wonderful because the Vernon family were very well aware of what was up to date, but at the same time harking back to the great Elizabethan era. And of course, in the later part of the 17th century, you can imagine that people were harking back, like we are in a way now, to a time of calm prosperity. And so let's go inside. This is the Long Gallery at Sudbury. Again, a very old-fashioned room for a house built in after the middle of the 17th century. But the only thing really old-fashioned about it is the layout of the room itself. The plasterwork, the great Baroque plasterwork we see in the ceiling, is very much of its time. And it was done by Edward Pierce. And you've got, Pettifer and Bradbury, the plasterwork was, and the rest of the woodwork in the house, some of it is by Grinling and Gibbons. But it's very much an up-to-date interior, but in an old-fashioned setting. And this is, I think, typical of the English, this reticence to be too avant-garde. You know, you think of the Georgian townhouses in London. From the outside, they all look the same, and inside they are completely wild and joyful. But there's this English modesty, which I think is why perhaps the country house in England holds such a place in people's hearts. So from Sudbury to arguably the most famous house in Derbyshire, Chatsworth. This is the south front. I love it because it has not got a central bay. It's got an equal number of windows. They're not odd numbers. So you don't have a central door, for example. It's bizarre, but it's of the time where we were looking to France and to the great Baroque architecture over there, Vaux-le-Vicomte, these sort of places, and people were really experimenting. And this magnificent south front was designed no less by Talman, who was one of the great Baroque architects of the time. But Chatsworth itself has been in the Cavendish family since 1549. And there's a wonderful picture of it on a tapestry, which I think is still in the collection at Chatsworth, showing Bess of Hardwick's original house, with its staterooms on the top floor, something which Chatsworth preserved despite being a modern and up-to-date Baroque house. So you can see the tallest windows are on the first floor, and that famous suite of Hampton Court-like staterooms marches along that first floor there from right to left to the most important room, top left window, the closet at the end, where if you're really important, you'd be invited in there. So the original house had been begun in 1533, and it was Bess of Hardwick's husband, Sir William Cavendish, who heard the lolly, and Bess of Hardwick liked building things. From 1687, Chatsworth was very much rebuilt, but it was rebuilt piecemeal around the courtyard. It's built around a quadrangle, a huge quadrangle. In 1694, really to coincide with this, the Dukedom of Devonshire was created, and so a suitably grand house was needed. And as in the century before, the Cavendish family led the way in using the top craftsmen. Jean Tijoux, I think, came and did some of the ironwork, and his followers. And I mean, it was extraordinarily, and it is an extraordinarily fine house. So, as I said, the south front was the first part of the scheme of this rebuilding, and designed by William Talman. And it is also notable for the fact it doesn't have any visible attic or hipped roof. You have a flat roof, the crown of the building undisturbed by leadwork and anything like that. It is purely for show, with these extraordinarily large urns. And then the family motto in gold, blazoned in the entablature above the pilasters there. And then we go to see the west front, Chatsworth's probably friendliest front, and also most familiar to the world. On a vast scale, I was reading somewhere that it's only 9 bays wide, and actually it is double the width of most 9-bay country houses. It's like a giant doll's house sitting in this wonderful valley. And this front was perhaps designed by Thomas Archer, but from 1699, but most likely the Duke, the first Duke, had a hand in it himself. So it's got this slightly charmingly gawky look to it. It's not completely correct. And again, where you should have the lower floor on the top floor, it is the highest floor. So Chatsworth again is friendly and not at all what you might expect really from one of the greatest palaces in this country. So we'll go inside now, as many of you will have been in the past. This is the chapel on the left, Damien Hirst's bronze, where the altar normally would be at the moment. And again, the Cavendishes here used the very finest craftsmen and also painters, including Louis Laguerre and Antonio Verrio. And these two worked all over the country in the grandest buildings, but particularly for the royal court. So this is really outside the royal palaces, and even within the royal palaces, this is probably the finest chapel of its type, private chapel from the later part of the 17th century. And on the right-hand side, actually, no, I just mentioned, sorry, the reredos here as well is an extraordinary confection, carved by Samuel Watson and designed by Cibber. And it is an extraordinarily grand thing, created from Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire alabaster, and then Ashford marble columns, those black columns, this peculiar to Derbyshire stone, highly polished. And then to the left and right of it, on the volutes, the slightly curving things, below the first story, or the second story of the reredos, you can see actually there are ladies reclining on these volutes, and they're painted, so they're trompe l'oeil. They're not actually made of marble. And on the right, you can see the Sabine room, now a bedroom, but originally a sort of, I suppose, important viewing room, another sort of sitting room type chamber. Painted 1707 by James Thornhill. The Cavendish family were great Whig patrons. And this room here, you can see the story of the Wraith of Sabines across the ceiling. Apparently it's a room where I was reading someone's diary, which was published, and they were saying that it was always a slightly terrifying room to sleep in with this gruesome thing going on the ceiling, but an extraordinarily grand space. So on this floor, you have the famous suite of staterooms, which one of the dukes actually tried to tear down because they were so very out of fashion, but then someone implored him to hold on to them because they were so important. And here they look double the length because very cleverly, even the Cavendishes couldn't quite stump up, to have it double the length. So the great mirror right at the end. And we are looking from the most important rooms, the closets, right down the enfilade. The final room is the state dining room. So if you were vaguely important, you might get in there. If you were pretty important, the next room, very important, the next room, very, very important, the next room, very, very, very important. And then this was the idea of the grand apartment, the royal apartment, influenced so much by Versailles and the great French palaces. And the more important you were, the further along you got. And if there was a royal visit, somewhere like Chatsworth would have had the space and the appropriate grandeur for the retinue and for this sort of thing. And the very grandest of the people, if the king or queen were there, you would actually, the state apartment, if you like, would start at the front gates. So if you were someone like me, you'd be sort of way back from the front gates. And if you got more important, you'd be sort of going further and further, and until you finally got to the closet right at the end here. And this wonderful suite of rooms with their Baroque ceilings, the parquet flooring, so the wood laid like that, very much the French effect. And this enfilade, these doors in line with each other from the French to show the vastness of the house. And the rest of Chatsworth, of course, is later work by Sir Geoffrey Wyatville. The house got a 400-foot wing put on, including a library, and then the great dining room, which is, one person likened it to be eating inside a giant trunk, expecting, because it's got a cove ceiling, expecting a giant to pull off the lid and stare at you, and then the sculpture gallery. I mean, it is stupendous. And there's a theatre even at the end, which I'm longing to see one day. But it is an extraordinary place. So if you haven't been, I hope most of you have, you must go. So on to another very grand Baroque house in Derbyshire, but slightly not in quite such a good state. This is Sutton Scarsdale, a house which through the eras seems to have largely gone beyond its owner's budget for living in. And sadly, it now is without windows and is a ruin. It was built for Nicholas Leake, 4th Earl of Scarsdale, in 1724 by Francis Smith of Warwick. And it was actually the rebuilding of an earlier house, but it was at a level with Chatsworth for the grandeur, really, and also for the fact it used the top craftsmen from around the country, including Francesco Vassalli, a great Italian stucador plasterer, and the Altari brothers, Giuseppe and Adalberto. So you can see here one of the rooms inside. Regrettably, Sutton Scarsdale has none of its interiors left in this country, but you can see some of them slightly changed form in Philadelphia in the Museum of Art. Sutton Scarsdale fell into the hands of the Arkwright family at one point. So it was, a real status symbol, this house. And then it was going to be demolished at one point. And luckily, Sir Osbert Sitwell from nearby Renishaw stepped in, bought the ruin and saved it all for us to enjoy all these decades later. And it's there on this great journey along the M1. You have it on the left, then you have Hardwick on the right, then you have Bolsover further up on the hill on the right. And it's pretty magnificent. So you can go and explore the ruin. It's owned by English Heritage. And it's rather wonderful because it's a very interesting way of seeing the construction of these great stately homes. You see that, literally, you see the bones of it. So on to Kedleston Hall, another one of our internationally acclaimed houses here in Derbyshire. Built for the Curzon family, who have been resident in Derbyshire as quiet, sedate landed gentry really for 800 years. And it was built by Robert Adam, rebuilt by Robert Adam, because it was he took on from James Payn and Brettingham before, so he took on someone else's plans and he reimagined it. From 1759, it was his first major country house for the first Baron Scarsdale. And oddly enough, Nathaniel Curzon, who built it, had not actually been on the Grand Tour himself, but he wanted to keep up with he wanted to be a great aristocrat. So he looked to places like Holkham and said, I want a house like that, so build me one like that. So, as I said, it was the first major country house by Adam, and also one of the first great houses in the neoclassical style. Matthew Brettingham and James Payne had started the north front you see here. And then Adam came along. He was barely 30 years old and took over the whole project. And you see here the harmony of the Palladian getting into the neoclassical idiom. So you've got what would be, to most people, pretty large country houses themselves to the left and right. On the left, you have the family wing, which the Curzon family still live in. And then you have the central block, the staterooms, and then on the right, the kitchen wing. And so the National Trust shop, eatery, cafes in the right wing, left wing, family, central wing, still the staterooms. The quadrant, so the corridor leading into the family wing, has curved floorboards. The one leading into the staff wing has floorboards laid like a fan, so much more cheaply laid. But it's the structure of the English country house. You can very clearly see the importance of different parts of it and who was supposed to go into it. So Adam said he was pleased to have a client, and this is a quote, resolved to spare no expense, with 10,000 a year, very Jane Austen, good-tempered and having a taste himself for the arts. Adam designed nearly every aspect of the interior at Kedleston. He had most admired Holkham Hall, so you really see quite a lot of that in the Great Hall, the marble hall here at Kedleston. Ambitious Adam showed Curzon some of his drawings from Rome. His client was, and I quote Adam again, struck all of a heap with wonder and amaze at every new drawing he saw, made him grieve at his previous engagement with Brettingham. He carried me home in his chariot about 3 and kept me till 4, seeing said Brett's designs, and asking my opinion. I proposed alterations and desired he might call them his own fancies. So Adam was pretty clever at flattery and then getting jobs. Ironically, he never really designed many houses in their entirety. So Matthew Brettingham, who'd been here first, had based the plan of Kedleston on Palladio's Villa Moncenigo. And of course, Palladio was the great man who caused this whole movement in architecture in Britain. Palladio had taken first-hand sketches and deep looking at the Roman and classical Greek original buildings, and he translated into something of his own, fused really with the Italian Renaissance, and created what then became known as Palladian architecture. So this design, Villa Moncenigo. Adam redesigned the north front, but he largely followed theirs, but he had to, for example, in the center, beneath this great hexastyle portico, so it's a 5-bay portico in the center, he took out the windows because he wanted his great hall to be like the Roman atrium, so lit from above like a courtyard. And the south front of Kedleston was really his most daring thing. So here we see a plan of Kedleston as it was going to be built. The top left and right bits never were built, and they were going to be great galleries on the south front. So Kedleston was never finished. Bottom left, you've got the family wing. Right, you've got the kitchen with a double height kitchen in the center. And in the center, you've got this magnificent space with these 2 major rooms, the lower one with the columns around it, the marble hall, the atrium, and then the top one, the saloon, basically echoing the idea of a Roman vestibulum. This is the south front of Kedleston. It is magnificent, but it looks charming and interesting, but actually it's very, very novel, this, because in the center of it, you have got an actual almost reproduction of the Arch of Constantine imposed on the center of the building. The idea of the Triumphal Arch, which you were awarded if you were a successful Roman general and you won a battle. And here you have it in the center of the building. And towering behind it, you have what Adam saw as the dome of the Pantheon in Rome. So all of these gestures to ancient Rome, which very much also would have pleased Curzon, because it was very much showing about he could travel and knew about what was going on the continent. Inside, one of the great neoclassical rooms of Europe, this is the Marble Hall. And it is the most imposing room Adam ever created. It is top lit, as I was saying before, the windows on the sides were taken out, so that it could feel like this idea of a Roman atrium. The Temple of Mars was the source for the niches, and the hall takes the form of, as I said, of a Roman atrium. The Corinthian order is seen here, as shown in the Temple of Jupiter in the Roman Forum. And around the walls are 12 painted benches based on the so-called tomb of Agrippa, which Adam had studied in Rome. Each of these columns here, they originally were not fluted, and the fluting is these little incised lines down them to give them a bit more texture. Anyway, it was decided, oh, they must be fluted. So some poor chap had to come and flute them in situ, in the hall. Dr. Johnson, I believe, was very rude about them, but I think some people are just very critical. So here we see the saloon beyond the hall, 62 feet high. Adam wrote about this, wrote about the Pantheon, which he visited in 1755, which was the influence of this. He said, "The greatness and simplicity of parts fills the mind with extensive thoughts, stamps upon you the solemn, the grave, and the majestic, and seems to prevent all those ideas of gaiety or frolic, which our modern buildings admit of and inspire." For the ceiling of the saloon at Kedleston, Adam took the rosettes and octagonal compartments on the dome from the Pantheon, and also the alcoves from two other Roman buildings, one being the Basilica of Maxentius. And it's a pretty magnificent room. And on the right, you see the state dining room, a more typical Adam room, much lighter plasterwork, and those colours we so associate with Adam. And also a room which I'm very fond of. I remember going there as a child and my father pointing out to me the corner of the room where the two doors are and saying, look, even someone like Robert Adam can really cock up, because the sideboard end of the room, the far end, the door case on the left, you can see it actually juts into the door case with the pediment on the wall on the left. So it's almost as if Adam hadn't really considered how they would fit together. And Caroline Percy, who I run historic decoration with down in London, Caroline always points out that Adam hated corners. And so we go around Zion House, where our talks are based, and we spot all the corners. And this is one of the corners Adam clearly completely overlooked. So at the same time as all this neoclassicism was going on, of course, Gothicism was happening, really started by Horace Walpole and Sanders and Miller and various people like that. And it became very fashionable at the same time, really, as neoclassicism, but really within the Rococo movement, a much more frivolous side of the middle part of the 18th century. So this is this axial hall at Tissington, 1609 space, but actually, apart from the panelling, completely redone in the Georgian times. In 1757, this marvelous chimney piece with its overmantel was put in the center of the room here. And it's notable for its Gothic style, which was again, not a style which we necessarily associate with the Georgian era, but actually whether it was with a fireplace or a temple in the garden or a grotto for a hermit or something like that, there was always often a Gothic nod in these buildings. So here at Tissington, the Fitzherberts decided to have a Gothic chimney piece in the centre of the room. And also, unlike a lot of the other families, they were very long established here. So Gothic was also assigned to say that. This peculiar perpendicular style of Gothic as well, which very much was the English Gothic. It very much accentuated the perpendicular, the vertical, and lightness of touch. So the Georgians liked it, and it went very well with the Rococo. So here we have this wonderful, wonderful chimney piece in the central hall here at Tissington. So just to show you what was going on alongside the neoclassical work. So on to perhaps the most famous self-made man of Derbyshire, Sir Richard Arkwright, and his own great house at Cromford near Matlock, high above the River Derwent, which was so responsible for powering his riches. A strange house in many ways, basically a neoclassical plan, but given battlements. Very much in the vein of what Robert Adam would do with his castle-like architecture up at places like Culzean in Scotland. So very much classical building, but with a little bit of icing, Gothic and castle-like icing, but not particularly convincing as a castle. Also very odd, the sort of gentry thought, because right opposite is a huge, great cliff. And they all said, well, why on earth build a house facing a cliff? It's a very odd thing to do. But like any good businessman, he kept his business very, very close to him, and his mills are behind the cliff. And if you go down to the wharf at Cromford. You'll see where a lot of the power for his industrial enterprises happened has also got a side of it with battlements on it. So from the house, it looks like a folly. But Arkwright was very clever, and he became the very, very richest untitled person in England. And it wasn't thanks to building houses and not having factories. It was having both. Anyway, very unfortunately, this original house built for him by William Thomas between 1789 and 1790 was not completed before Richard could move in, because very unfortunately, it was burnt in a great fire in 1791. And so the interior was redone by Thomas Gardiner of Uttoxeter, so another Midland man, just over in Staffordshire across the border. And inside is one of the loveliest spaces in any of the Derbyshire country houses, really. It might as well be in Portman Square in London or somewhere like that. This lovely elliptical 3-story staircase hall, which you can go and see at Willersey, or well, you certainly could. I believe Willersey's for sale or has been sold now. But for a long time, it was a hotel run by the Methodists. But it's rather lovely that Richard Arkwright, who probably in his heart of hearts might have wanted to be like the great landed gentry of Derbyshire, but at the same time, he never got to live in this great house of his. He wanted his children to marry very well. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And what he did leave, though, was Derbyshire really becoming the home of the Industrial Revolution. If you haven't been to Cromford, you really must, because Cromford is a wonderful example of an estate village, but also an industrial village. It's a very strange combination, and it's wonderfully preserved with these small houses and rows of houses with their large windows. So the people there could be on the hand looms and things, and then you can go to, of course, to the great factory itself, which has been so wonderfully restored recently and is still undergoing a restoration. So there is Willersey Castle. We go forward a little bit more to Renishaw Hall. And here, seen from part of Sir George Sitwell's marvellous Italianate garden. A great, spooky, magnificent house of so many parts. And it was, I think, the late Sir Rearsby, who was so involved in the trust, was a tremendous theatrical character in a way. And I remember when I went there, when I was much younger, and I went to dinner there, and we went past this doll's house leading into the dining room, and he said, "Shh." I said, "What?" And I said, "Where are the dolls though?" He said, "They're getting ready for the opera and having a rest now, don't disturb them." And it was this eccentric house, and it always has been quite an eccentric house. But here you see this, what really is essentially an E-shaped 17th century house in the middle, 1625. So just to the left and right of those two very sort of naked statues, probably very cold in that part of Derbyshire. That's the earliest part of the house. To the left is the dining room wing, to the right, the drawing room, and an enormous ballroom put on by the marvellously named Sir Sitwell for when he became a baronet and entertained the Prince Regent here. Renishaw has been home to the Sitwell family for 350 years. They were colliery owners and ironmasters, and I think they had the fame of being the largest manufacturer of iron nails in the world. Very glamorous and very useful, actually, because they were able to create this marvelous house. Inside, you've got rooms like this. This is the dining room, and with plasterwork and designs by Joseph Badger of Sheffield for Sir Sitwell. Very much trying to keep up with the Joneses, if you like, or really the Curzons, actually, in this case. This, if you can compare it to what we saw at Kedleston a little bit earlier on, this is wonderfully sort of provincial in feel compared to the almost courtly elegance of Robert Haddon. Here you've got these lovely Ionic pilasters, slightly strange scale, with a very heavy moulding above the buffet niche there in the apse. And then this very quite heavy and almost quite primitive plasterwork there, absolutely charming room, and on a huge scale, and filled with some of the marvelous things that the Sitwell family have. And on the other side of the building, you've got these two great rooms, the drawing room, the floor of which is painted to resemble inlaid wood by Lady Sitwell, Penelope Lady Sitwell, and then beyond that, the magnificent ballroom with the Belisarius painting at the end. It's an absolutely extraordinary space. And of course, it was the childhood home of Edith, Osbert, and Sacheverell, that literary trio. And it really is a house that it lives and breathes its history. It's got an atmosphere like nowhere else. So that leads us very nicely on, actually, to another house, which is famous almost more for the characters that inhabited it than for its architecture. This is Cork Abbey, a very early spot, of course, a monastic spot, and one of those great estates sandwiched near Staunton Harold, Melbourne, a sort of hidden world in this part of Derbyshire. And it had been home to the Harper family for 400 years, taken over by the National Trust in 1985 and nicknamed the house that time forgot. They found a box with a state bed hangings, a gift probably from the Queen, the time which had never been opened. There was more taxidermy than you could possibly imagine. I mean, every single dead animal you could possibly imagine was dotted around part of it. Rooms full of clutter, most of it just clutter, but it had been left completely undisturbed for 100 years or more. So the house was remodeled between 1701 and 1704 for Sir John Harper. The family later became Harper Crewe. And you can see here on the each side of the house has got these pavilion type structures. So really it's got these almost like 4 separate wings and a portico in the center. Each of these wings would have had separate apartments within it, so dressing rooms, bedrooms, sitting rooms, so little self-contained flats, if you like, for visiting grandees. You don't get the feeling, though, that the Harpers ever really wanted to have these visiting grandees. This house is so hidden. And in the center of it, the reason why I had it here is you've got a portico, very much of its type, Regency era portico in the center of the house, put on as almost a nod to fashion by the Harpers. But really, apart from that, a very undisturbed, great Baroque house. And within it, this is my final slide, is the drawing room, refitted by Sir Henry Harper between 1793 and 1794, and substantially altered in 1855 to 1861. And the clutter is something which I suppose to our modern eyes, but most of us are probably young fogies or whatever, we probably quite like clutter, I certainly do. But to most people, the clutter is fairly extraordinary here. Also the wild abandon of styles and everything, but it's a marvelous example of a Victorian space. And you go to Cork, you walk into these Victorian rooms, everything is covered in different sort of loose covers. You've got velvet, tassels, taxidermy, fossils, rather ugly bits of china, some okay paintings, some nice ones, wall coverings to look like leather. I mean, a complete mixture, patterns everywhere, maximalism, which I think is something which we've got to try and bring back, because end to minimalism, we need to get color and maximalism back into our lives. But I thought it's a rather lovely final slide of this, just to show you as we get into the Victorian era of what was happening in Derbyshire. And so after this, of course, there are many other important country houses in Derbyshire. From the Victorian era, we lost Osmaston Manor, perhaps the grandest of the Victorian houses near Ashbourne, but there are still magnificent examples at places like Ogston Hall in the Brackenfield, which is a magnificent Victorian house with 2 towers, one of which has a spire. Then later on, you've got some important building by Lutyens. You've got the billiard room at Renishaw Hall, a very, very fluent and stylish room built again for the Sitwells. It's not the Sitwells, sorry. Yes, the Sitwells, going mad. And then later on, at perhaps the finest early Georgian house in the county certainly, but if not further on, Radburn Hall, John Fowler was employed by the late Mrs. Shanders Poole to restore. Because he restored, he didn't necessarily take things down. He very much would rather clean than repaint something, but he restored those extraordinary rooms there in that lovely classical house. So Derbyshire is exceptionally rich in country houses, as you all know, but I hope this has been an introduction to some of the lesser known houses, but also a refresher to some of the most famous houses. And also, yes, it's been a huge honour for me to talk about a county I adore, and also for the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust, a great charity which has been so galvanised under the chairmanship of Derek. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And I'm going to now take my gin and tonic and wish you all a very happy New Year again. And thank you very much for watching and listening.
Thank you, Ollie. We're not going to let you get away quite that easily, because we're going to ask Lucy to summarize some of the questions that have been put, so that you could just give those a few answers. But before I do that, I just want to say thank you from me and from the Trust. It's such a wonderful peregrination through the all the houses, so wonderfully put together. And it's the way in which you have personalized it. You really feel as if you know every single one of those houses personally. And that's been excellent to listen to. But I'm going to hand over to Lucy to forward the questions.
Okay,
Just before I do, finally, one last thing. For those that came later, this talk is free, but we would like you to donate if you would feel this has been worthwhile, to help us run more of these events. And if you're not a friend of the Trust, to consider joining as a friend of the Trust. And Lucy will be emailing you in the next couple of days to give you the opportunity to do that. Sorry, so over to Lucy.
Okay, Ollie. So the first question from Sir Richard Fitzherbert is, why are there so many country houses in Derbyshire per square mile compared to other counties?
Well, apart from it probably being the nicest county in England, I think it's not just the scenery or the people or the food or anything. That'd be silly. I suppose it's again this extraordinary richness of lead mining, limestone for building work, and then later on the Industrial Revolution being born here. Later on, more stone being used for the railways. I think it's always, and also it's in the centre of England. It's not too far away. It's close to what were and still are very important towns. It's famous for its natural landscape architecture, but I suppose there are a lot of mega houses in Derbyshire.
People gather together, don't they?
But then there are a huge amount of much smaller manor houses. So we're seeing these huge staccatos in Chatsworth or Hardwick or Sudbury or Kedleston. But a lot of the Derbyshire houses are a bit like the churches. There are no huge Gothic churches in there. They're much smaller, and that's often where the charm lies. But I think it's this combination of agriculture, building materials, and also lead mining. And I'm sure other people would have many other reasons for it. And natural beauty that have made Derbyshire such a hotspot for people wanting to have their houses here.
That kind of ties into the next question, Ollie, which is what distinguishes the country houses in Derbyshire? Is there something that links them all, or individually drawn from contemporary styles in use more widely, do you think?
Well, there's certainly one person who seems to link a lot of them, is Bess of Hardwick at the start, and the Cavendish family, who've been so instrumental in changing the face of the county for the better with marvellous architecture. One thing that links all of these houses together, I suppose, is the fact that Derbyshire is quite a wild and barren county. So they're very well built. A lot of them at the beginning, of course, had these very small windows, thick walls. Later on, as Derbyshire became more accessible, the windows grew larger, the houses became much more open, and Derbyshire became a place where the great families would come outside the London season back up here. What links them all together? I suppose probably actually trade and industry, because any family that really made it big had interests in trade and industry. So you think of the Hurt family, the Sitwell family, the Cavendishes would have owned quarries, mines, all the rest. So I suppose trade and industry and natural the topographical setting of all these places. The natural beauty also dictates quite a lot of the architecture. So that was a wishy-washy answer, but
no, that's fine. That's good. Martha would like to know: are most of these houses open to the public?
Yes, of those houses we've just looked at, I think they're all open to the public, actually. Yeah, absolutely. And I think after this period of time, we all need to be as visiting as possible to these places, because they've all been ready for business and they've had to close their doors after doing a lot of restoration and making sure they're as welcoming as possible for us general public to go around. So yes, they are open, and I'd be delighted to, I can send Lucy a list of all of the ones we've just looked at. And yes, you can go and see them all, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. And then we've got a question from Matthew Paris, who wants to know how familiar would Derbyshire's people have been with these houses and their interiors at the time they were being built and lived in afterwards?
Thank you, Matthew. One of our judges for the awards, very, very hardworking judge. Matthew, yes, well, people would have been familiar because, of course, country house visiting is something which is not just our generation or, a 20th century or 21st century phenomena. From the moment places like Kedleston were built, you could have gone along, the housekeeper would have made a nice little packet from letting us go round, as they would have done in Jane Austen's time, to go and see what was going on. Somewhere like Chatsworth had a public road and a village next door to it. Of course, it was later moved, the village, by one of the dukes. So yes, people would certainly have known what was going on. And of course, it's always good that the locality knows what's going on because you want them on your side, especially in the earlier times where you didn't have these great parks around your houses. The village was often right next door to the house. So yes, even in those times, you could probably make an appointment with the housekeeper to go and look around the houses. And so the styles would filter from London, from the royal court, through the aristocracy, then to the gentry houses, and we could have all gone and peered in them and had a nice look, yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I think I've picked up most of the questions now, Ollie. Everyone, a lot of people saying thank you for a really amazing and informative.
Pleasure.
A lot of people saying they can't wait for places to be open again so they can go and visit.
Yeah,
so unless anyone wants to pop a final couple of questions in the chat, I think that's it.
Well, I'm very relieved because I could waffle enough to just about cope with those.
Yeah.
When I heard Sir Richard Fitzherbert was doing the first one, I was worried. Anyway, it was cool.
Well, can I just say thank you to everyone and watch this space because there's going to be more of these events. We've had over 140 people participating today. So it's really, really good to get such a good following. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. Same place, same station. Bye-bye for now.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.